Hey everyone, in this video we're going to take a look at chapter 41 from book 5 of Caesar's De Bello Gallico. So you remember at this point we're looking at Ambiorix's Revolt, which is right in the middle of the Gallic Wars around 54 BC, and it's really taking place in this eastern part of Belgium, kind of on the border with Germany, where Caesar has just conquered, or recently conquered this area. Now they're having this uprising, right, due to his trip over to Britain. So at this part in the narrative we've already seen that Cicero's camp is the one that's under attack. He's tried sending out some messengers. Remember in chapter 40, he promised all these great rewards if anyone could get through. So he sends out the messengers to try to get help from Caesar. All these messengers are intercepted, right? So no help is really coming. And he's surrounded by the Nervi, right? At this point, they've been fighting. His men have been building up the camp, right? Working day and night, fighting off the Gauls. They're all tired. They're wounded. Cicero is tired, right? We kind of read through all that in the previous chapter, and now we're going to see the next part of the story as Ambiorix is going to try to play the same trick on Cicero that he did on Sabinus and Cotta. So before we dive too far into it, like I always say, the first thing you want to do whenever you run into a new chapter is try to get the vocab, right? Just so you know what the words mean. There's a lot of great stuff out there. You can go on Quizlet or whatever you want to use, any commentary, and you'll find really good vocab lists. Take one of those, learn it. That way you at least know what the words are and you have a chance of understanding it. It's just really hard to read through anything if you don't know what the vocab is, so always start there. The other thing I would always tell you to do, try reading this aloud, right? Try to read it. If you can get a classmate, that's perfect. Read it to them, work on your speaking, your pronunciation, then have that person or classmate read it back to you so you can work on your listening skills. These are always really great ways to make sure that you're really understanding the Latin and not just kind of translating in your head. When it does come time for translation, though, try the read and reread method. You hear me say this on all my videos, but it works. I suggest it all the time with my students. I have them use it. You read through the story of the chapter, in this case, once. You write down any problem areas you have, and then at the end, when you're done, you look at those problem areas to see where you went wrong and what you didn't understand. Then you try to fix it, right? If it's vocab, that's pretty easy. Just grab a dictionary or a commentary and look it up. You'll be okay. If it's grammar, it could be a little trickier. You could either try looking it up on your own, or again, this is where a good commentary will help you out. It might be something that you just didn't see or an idiom that'll kind of help you understand it. So try to work through and see if you can kind of patch up all those mistakes you made and then do it again, right? You repeat this process over and over again. And the more you do it, every time your list of problems should get smaller and smaller until you're able to read this start to finish and you understand most, if not all of it. Now, like I always say, most of the time, the people reading this part of Caesar are doing the AP curriculum. There's not a ton of time, right, to really dedicate to all these things, but you're trying to lock it into your long-term memory, particularly if you're reading Caesar either the year before the AP or maybe in the fall of your AP class. It's really hard to remember what you did months ago when it comes time for the test. So trying this trick will really help you put it into your long-term memory so that hopefully you have a shot of remembering it when it comes time for the test. Okay? So if you haven't done that yet, pause the video, go work on that, right? Do a little background work. But otherwise, we're going to move forward, take it line by line, and try to unpack it a little bit, okay? So chapter 41 starts like this. You have tunc duces principesque nerviorum qui aliquem sermonis aditum causamque amicitiae cum Cicerone habebant, colloqui se velle dicunt, okay? So you have then the duces principesque, right? So you have the leaders and the chiefs is kind of one way to do it. The leaders and the chiefs of the Nervi, right? So you have Nerviorum there, right? The Nervi are the ones, again, besieging the camp. So they're leaders and they're chiefs, right? And then you have some of whom, right, or who had, habebant is really where you're going here. So some had the auditum. So auditum there can really mean like an entryway, if you want to kind of think of it that way. It just means like more of an ability, right? The ability to talk to Cicero. So you see some commentaries call it like access or entry or something like that, right? An approach is kind of fine, but it's talking about some of these leaders who had this access of conversation, right? Their ability to talk with Cicero and cause of friendship, causamque amicitiae, right? With Cicero. So they try to speak to him on this way of like, hey, let's be friends, right? Let's have a conversation, right? So this is kind of who approaches some leaders who approach Cicero. So these men, they decont, they say, right? You have the indirect statement here. They say that they want, say, well, remember, say is just the duplication. So they say that they want colloquy to speak with him, right? So these leaders and these chiefs of the Nervi, they said that they want to converse. They want to have a conversation with Cicero. So there's a pause in the action, and this should feel very familiar because this is exactly what happened with Sabinus and Cotta, right? There was sort of that first attack, and then the leaders, in that case, it was Ambiorix. They say, no, let's have a talk, okay? So they're about to try to pull the trick on Cicero. Then you have the next line. You have facta potestate, eadem quae ambiorix cum titurio egerat commemorant, there we go, omnem esse in armis Galliam, Germanos renum transisse, Caesaris reliquorumque hiberna appugnari. Okay? So you start with this ablative absolute, right? So facta potestate, right there. With you could probably even translate this as like with permission having been given, or you might even say like that's kind of the literal one, with opportunity having been made. It's definitely like an idiomatic phrase. So you want to kind of take it in that way. So in other words, it's just saying they're able to have this peace talk, right? So they pause the battle, facta potestate, right? Permission is given, and now they're gonna have their discussion, okay? And you have eadem quae ambiorix, so you're saying the same which Ambiorix had discussed, right? Egerat had discussed with Titurius, right? Sabinus. So it's saying the same things which they had discussed, or which Ambiorix had discussed with Sabinus, Titurius here. Commemora, they recall. So in other words, they bring up the same things that Ambiorix had said to Titurius. It's this thread of why he should leave the camp, right? They're pulling the same trick, basically. So what do they say? Well, you have a list of the things that they say. That all Gaul, right? Omnem Gallium, all of Gaul was in arms, esse in armis, right? And that the Germans had crossed Transisse, had crossed the Rhine River, the Rhenum, right? So all of Gaul is in revolt, and the Germans are coming, okay? And then you have the hiberna appugnare, that the winter quarters, right, are besieged. And the hiberna are described as Caesaris reliquorum, right? So it's the winter quarters of Caesar and of the rest, which would mean like, and of the rest of his legates. Remember, he split his army into all these different winter quarters. All of them are being besieged. So in other words, they're repeating the same thing again that Ambiorix said to Sabinus: you need to leave this fort. You're in trouble. Everyone is rebelling. All of Gaul is in arms. The Germans are coming. Caesar's bogged down. He's not helping, right? These are lies. But again, it's the same trick to try to see what Cicero will do. So it's kind of interesting that they pull the exact same thing, which makes sense, right? If it worked on Sabinus and Cotta, why wouldn't you try it again? Okay. Then you have adunt etiam de Sabini morte, right? And we'll just pick up this line right here because they add something, right? Adunt. They also add about or concerning the morte Sabini, the death of Sabinus. So in other words, they also add like, oh, by the way, Sabinus is dead, right? Which he is. That's the one thing that they kind of say in addition, or that they add here. They're pointing out like, hey, don't risk your own life, right? Sabinus is already dead, as a way of showing like, this is serious. Then you have ambiorigem ostentant, fide faciendae causa. Okay, so they ostentant, they put forth, or they show Ambiorix, right? Causa, for the sake of, you could say, for the sake of trust and making trust, you might even say. So of forming trust is probably a way to do it. So there you have that genitive gerundive, right? So you can just think of it as like forming trust is a good way to do it. So they're pointing to Ambiorix, or they're ostentat, they're showing Ambiorix as a way of building trust. So again, it's this idea of, hey, look, we have Ambiorix here. You can trust what we're saying. So again, they add that Sabinus is dead, and they kind of point to Ambiorix, or put forth Ambiorix rather, as this show of faith, right? This fide faciendae, this cause of making faith or making trust. Okay. Then you go to the next part. You have errare eos dicunt, si quidquam abhis praesidi sperent, qui suis rebus diffidant, se tamen hoc esse in Ciceronem populumque Romanum animo, ut nihil nisi hiberna recusent atque hanc in veterascere, right, consuetudinem nolent, right, and we'll kind of continue it from there, okay? But you keep saying this indirect statement of what they're saying, right? So you have errare eos dicunt is kind of where he starts with what else they're saying. So they say that they errare, they are wrong, they're making a mistake. If Spirit, if they hope for anything of praecidi, of protection from these men, abhis, right? So the praecidi there you can think of as being like protection, right? It's literally anything of protection. It's a partitive genitive, but any protection is probably a good way to do it. Now, there's a couple of pronouns happening here that we want to understand. They say, right, the deacon is talking about the Gauls, right, the Nervi. Eos is the Romans, though. So they're not saying that they themselves are wrong, right? They're saying the Romans, you can tell because of the use of Eos, right? They're not talking about themselves. So they're saying, hey, Romans, you're making a mistake if you're hoping for any help from these men. The abhis is really talking about Caesar and the other winter quarters, everyone they just listed. So they're trying to convince them, saying, hey, we know you've been sending out messengers and you're hoping that someone's coming, but nobody's coming, right? We killed all of them and they're all besieged. So they're trying to really force Cicero to feel that everything's hopeless here, okay? And it says, for the other part here, you have qui suis rebus diffidant, right? And it says they're wrong. Anyone who distrusts in their own situation. So in other words, it's saying there when you have diffidant there, right? They're distrusting or even like despairing. You might even say it's saying that they have their own problems, right? So the despair there, they're those who are already despairing in their own situation, right? So he's trying to again trick them into saying there's no hope coming, right? You're in trouble, right? And you should just basically give up. Okay. Then you have the next part again, the se se tamen hoc esse. Okay. So it says, however, they are, however, hoc animo, right, with this mind, right, is kind of one would do it. You could say that they are of this mind, meaning the nervii are of this mind towards Cicero in Ciceronem and the populumque Romanum and the Roman people. Right, it's saying, however, they kind of have this mindset towards the Roman and Cicero. So now with the ut clause here, we're going to get the exact thing that it's the result clause of what they feel. What is their mindset, the hoc animo towards Cicero and the Romans, right? So they say that they have this mind towards them, that recusent, they refuse nihil, nothing except hiberna, right? Nisi hiberna. So nothing except the winter quarters. That's the one thing that they do not want. Okay. And Nolan, they do not want hanc, this, right? The idea of the winter quarters, to be established in veterascere, to be established as consuetudinem, as a custom. Okay. So if we kind of parse this out, what he's saying is we're not going to hurt you, right? We're literally not going to refuse you anything. So we'll let you go. We just don't want you setting up winter quarters, right? The hiberna in our lands. So this is kind of interesting because again, they're claiming to be friends. And remember, they come to Cicero in Amicitiae is the line that happened a few lines ago, in friendship. They're like, we want to be your friends, right? We're willing to be your friends. We just don't want you to have a military presence in our territory, right? That's where they draw the line. So it sounds like it would be a reasonable sort of thing, not if you're Roman, but that's their offer. Like, we don't want to kill you all. We just don't want you to have military camps in our land. Okay. And then the line continues. You have licere illis incolumibus per se ex hibernis discere et quascunque in partes velent sine metu proficisci. Okay, so now they're going to get sort of the second half of what it is that they want. So the licere there is they continuing the statement that it is allowed, right? It's allowed for them, at least there is referring to the Romans. It's allowed for them in columibus, safely, you could say, I almost think it was sort of an adverb, safely to depart, discedere, right? So it's allowed for you guys, right, the Romans, to depart safely ex hibernis, from their winter quarters, per se, through them, meaning through the Nervi, right, the Gauls. So they say to them, we're good. You can leave. We just don't want you to have winter quarters. So why don't you just pack up and leave? Again, it's the exact same thing that they offered to Sabinus and Cotta. And not only that, but it's allowed proficisci, for them to set out sine metu, without fear, right? In whatever direction, quascunque in partes, right? In whatever direction they want. So in other words, they're saying you can leave. It's totally fine. As long as you're leaving, go whatever direction that you would want to, right? That you want to do. You have that present subjunctive there. So like take whatever direction you want, and you can do it sine metu, and that's sort of the key phrase here, without fear. So again, it sounds like they're offering them pretty good, but we know that this is a trick, right? They want them to leave the camp, which they've been besieging, by the way, for a few days. They just want the Romans out, right? So that's sort of the trick. And then we end with this. You have Cicero ad haec una modo responde. Non esse consuetudinem populi Romani accipere ab hoste armato conditionem. Si ab armis discedere velent, se adiutore utantor legatosque ad Caesara mita, sperare pro eius justitia quae petierent impetraturos. Okay, so we have all this stuff coming from the Gauls, right? Saying, hey, you can leave, we want to be friends, all these different things. Okay, and then you have Cicero, he only responds to these things, one thing. So here is kind of a key difference we see right off the bat. Cicero gives a very direct response. He doesn't waste time. He immediately gives what his response is. And he says, right, non esse, that it is not, again, we have the indirect statement here, that it's not the custom, the consuetudinem, the custom of the Roman people to accept a condition, accipere conditionem, right, to accept a condition from a hoste armato, from an armed enemy. And that should sound really familiar, because when you think back to Sabinus and Cotta, this was what Cotta was saying too. He's like, since when do we negotiate with armed enemies, right? This is what he was saying during the battle, all these things. And Cicero repeats that. He's like, no, we're not gonna have a conversation against an armed enemy. That's not what's happening. So he says, si ab armis discedere velent. So if they want to literally depart from their weapons, meaning to put their weapons down, right? To lay down their weapons, I guess, is kind of one way to do it. He says, if you want to lay down your weapons, then we can start to have a conversation. So again, he says, if they lay down their weapons, right? Utantor se adiutore, they might use him, say. So he's saying you could use me, is basically what he's getting at here. So he says they might employ him or use him as a helper or an advocate, however you want to do adiutore, right? Kind of like a helper is really what it's meaning. He says you could use him as a helper, right? Fine, I'll help you with this if you really want to do it. Put your weapons down. He says, and mitant, send legatosque, send envoys to Caesar, right? So he's like, if you want to do this, we're not doing it without Caesar. Put down your weapons, use me as a helper, and we're going to send some messengers to Caesar, and we'll figure all this out, right? That's his counter. And Cicero continues, the sperare there is really talking about Cicero. So he said that he hoped that on account of his justice. Now, eius here is not Cicero, it's Caesar, right? So he says, send things to Caesar. And then Cicero says, I hope, or he hoped, that on account of on account of Caesar's justice, Caesar's justitia, right? His justice, right? That impetraturos, they would obtain, right? Meaning the Gauls or the Nervii would obtain. It's really impetraturos esse. It's a future infinitive. So you have to kind of supply, I guess you'd supply something like nervios, they would obtain, right? The Nervii would obtain the things which, quae there is really the things which, they sought, right? Impetierent is really, petierent is really petiverent, right? There's a V missing there. So he says, he's hoping that on account of the justice of Caesar, that the Gauls, the Nervii, would obtain the things which they're seeking, right? The peace treaty. But Cicero says, this isn't my call, right? I'm not the leader. He says, go ahead, let's get Caesar involved. If you're serious, let's get Caesar. It's a very clever way of kind of calling their bluff, saying, hey, I'm not in a position of power to make this decision, which he knows the Nervii know as well, right? He's like, go get Caesar, right? We'll figure it out. It's, again, calling their bluff to say, if you really want peace, let's actually do this the proper way. Okay, so a couple of things to think about as you finish out this chapter. You want to notice again that the Gauls are doing the exact same trick, pretty close to the same trick that they used on Sabinus and Cotta, but there's a pretty apparent difference in leadership, right? You can see how Cicero does not respond the same way that Sabinus and Cotta did, and it kind of leads into chapter 40, where we're talking about the idea of having one man in charge, one leader instead of two. You can see it here; it's very apparent. The other thing that's interesting is that the Nervi come allowing the Romans to be friends, right? They use the word amicitia, like, hey, let's be friends, but they don't let the Romans winter in their lands. So there's a problem here, right? The custom is all the allies of the Romans, they allow the Romans to have winter quarters, right? It's a protection deal, basically. It's good for the Romans. It's kind of good for the allies, if that makes sense. So there's something odd here that you have to read into it. If you want to be friends, why wouldn't you let us have our winter quarters here, right? It's not a very friendly thing to offer. So there's a contradiction in the offer. Okay. The other thing that's interesting to note is that the Gauls are giving all these various reasons, right, of why he should leave and we should have peace, and the people are going all these things, but Cicero gives just one response, right? So they're offering all these reasons why he should leave, and Cicero just says, like, okay, here's my one thing. That's sort of a mark of a true, like, Roman commander. Be decisive, make the right decision. He's like, we're not going to go back and forth. Boom, here's my one response, and it's the right one. Okay, and Caesar's definitely calling out Cicero's doing the right thing here, right? He's kind of holding him up as what should have happened with Sabinus and Cotta. And lastly, Cicero's reason of not negotiating, right, with the armed enemy, we mentioned it. That's the same logic Cotta had, right? But he was overruled. So again, when you see this, right, Cicero kind of echoing the logic of Cotta, it really goes back to how Sabinus is the bad guy, right? And he was mentioned in this chapter again, his death, right? And notice how Cotta wasn't really mentioned. Sabinus keeps coming across over and over again as being the problem, right? The reason why it went poorly in the other camp. And again, it's just an interesting way of comparing. These chapters should be read as a direct comparison to what we saw earlier in Book 5 with Sabinus and Cotta, right? And you're seeing what was supposed to happen with Cicero against what happened with Sabinus and Cotta, and you can kind of see how this idea of the different styles in leadership. Okay, and Caesar rather definitely is putting them up as a comparison against each other. So if you have any questions at all on the translation, anything like that, put it in the comments below. Always happy to help and kind of walk you through it. Or if you're curious about anything I said, I'm sure there's a mistake in there somewhere. Just let me know and we'll figure it out. But otherwise, keep reading through this chapter. Hopefully it made some sense. And like I always tell you, just keep rereading it, reading and rereading it, I should say, until you're able to do it start to finish. And most of it, if not all of it, makes sense. That's how you know you're ready to move on. Good luck.